My name is Ryan Mosque, for any of you guys that don't know me. How many of you are new tonight? That's good. Well, actually, most people.
Second meetup ever.
What's that?
Second meetup ever in the other room socials.
Oh, so we're normally in the other room, and depending on topics, we usually range from kind of small groups like this up to like 70, 80 people. So it ranges quite a bit. But we generally, we're sort of different from typical meetups that most of them are kind of really focused on one technology or one framework. We try to be a little more of general interest. And typically, we focus on web technologies and web app technologies. But we've actually done things on Google Glass and other various things as well that are sort of more tangential, but things that we think are interesting to us and to people like us. So that's kind of what we're all about. And Corey and I both are JavaScript, Node, and other technologies. That's kind of what we're both focused on these days, though. And Corey will, of course, talk more about that for himself. So I'll leave it at that. If you guys have any questions about the meetup or questions for me or just want to chat or whatever, I'll certainly be around afterwards. So feel free to come introduce yourself. With that, I'll turn it over to Corey.
All right, so what Brian didn't say is the normal format for this. We usually do kind of just an overview of what's happened since the last meet, kind of what's new in the world of web, what's exciting, that kind of thing. And we didn't really have a lot of time to do that this time, so I kind of threw something together at the last second, and I'm going to keep it really abbreviated, but it's, that's kind of small on there. But long story short is Google I/O, the keynote was this morning, and there's some kind of interesting stuff. Got to check that out, so I'm going to cover a little bit of that before I dive into the main topic for the night, which is customize your workflow. And as Brian said, I'm Corey. Feel free to ask me questions if you got them, but my general background is development, business development as well, so both the tech and biz side. And that's kind of where all this comes into play tonight. It's kind of the inspiration behind this. So the first thing I'd like to cover is, like I said, Google I/O. They're kind of like everything that I found since we last did this. They're really been active. They covered a couple of different topics this morning, but the ones that I thought worthy of mentioning here are material design is kind of the next big thing. And do you know how to get this larger?
Control plus the difference.
Yeah, because I don't think.
Yeah.
Is that better? Ooh, a little too much.
Do you want any water? I'm gonna grab some.
Sure. Is that better? Okay. So material design was one of their talking points. I'm going to cover that in a second. Google Polymer was on the list. The next version of Android, Android L, that's all they're calling it right now. And then Android Wear, Android TV, there were a lot of different things, but very Android focused. And then the last thing in news is the new web development starter kit, which I'll cover here in a second. So material design, it's kind of a back to basics concept here. Really taking inspiration from paper, but unlike paper, you can expand your canvas. You can shrink it, you can do what you want. So in this photo down here, they animated this, but there's a series of levels. So kind of think of it maybe like there'll be Photoshop, where you can layer your images together, but you'll be doing it with code, you'll be doing it with CSS. And there's an elevation attribute. That's something that's kind of new that they're introducing. And this is included in Polymer, which I'll talk about in just a second. But just to give you a general idea, so they've got a lot of crazy colors here, but you can see just when I hover over things, there's little effects like little shadows. I'm not sure if, all right, so there's a couple of, oh, that's a PDF, it's not real exciting. All right, so I didn't check this demo before I came, but the idea is that it's going to be, the experience is supposed to be a bit more like you would expect it, like natural, fluid movements, more animations, that type of stuff. So that's something to keep an eye on. And then Google Polymer is anyone unfamiliar with Polymer? Okay, how about web components? Okay, so web components are essentially you're going to be able to create your own HTML tags. It's more of a declarative approach to development. And I'm going to show you a demo here. So developers, instead of having to write a lot of JavaScript code or having all of your HTML encapsulated in one place and CSS elsewhere, it ends up leveraging more features of the browser so that you can create your own tags and therefore create components that can be reused in basically any kind of application. And Google is not the only one doing it. Polymer is their project. There's also Mozilla doing Ext tags, and they've kind of come together on these things. So just an example here, this first one, the Google Analytics tag, that's something that you would just code right into your HTML. And the demo here is, so it just generates all of this for me. Just statistics and stuff like that. So you can reuse these anywhere you want. And this is a little bit more complicated example, I'd say. Normally you're going to see smaller widgets that will be pieced together into your app. But this is just obviously a demo here. But it's supposed to have the material design concepts baked into Polymer, which is, to me, kind of exciting because I've been working with this for a little while. And it's been kind of, I don't know, a little frustrating just because it is pretty fresh. And so having that design element wrapped in, it just makes it nice. It's easier to develop and reuse your components.
So that Google Analytics tag will pull analytics data into your own design?
Mm-hmm.
It's very useful.
Yeah, so yeah, like some of the other tags that they have, you'll see things like a nav bar or a drop-down menu or that kind of thing. So you're typically going to see smaller components, more of the basic building blocks. But this is a great example of how you can pull in data, you can pull in everything really encapsulated into one tag and say, hey, go use this tag. And I'm not going to dive into the how-to of this, but if you haven't checked out Polymer or Ext tags, I strongly recommend that you check it out. It is something that's only available for newer evergreen browsers, because it's not fully implemented with every browser out there yet. But in my personal opinion, this is kind of where things are going. So it's something to at least worth check out.
So it has a JavaScript library that goes along with it?
Right now, Polymer is a polyfill for web components. So there's a JavaScript library. There's some documentation around that. You essentially construct your code in bits of HTML, bits of JavaScript, and bits of CSS. That all ultimately kind of gets packaged together into what they call an HTML import. So at the top of your HTML code, you'll see an import for that HTML file, which then can of course include the CSS or the JavaScript, or it can be written right in that particular file if you want. But yeah, it's really just kind of bringing everything together and focusing on one small piece at a time, and then being able to reuse that across whatever projects you want to use it across.
Is it similar to Angular JS directives? I noticed you define your own tags in those.
Yeah, that it's interesting. I'm not super familiar with Angular, but from what I have dealt with, I feel like Angular will probably be merged with this because there are a lot of similarities.
There does seem to be some overlap there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. Yeah, Angular JS, you can just kind of make up your own tags. You give the whole implementation too, but then, just in your HTML, you say navbar or something, and then you'll have all your implementation for here's how to do a navbar elsewhere, and then your browser figures out, using JavaScript, how to stick it in there.
Yeah, and Angular definitely has a strong community behind it too, so if that's new to you, also worth checking out.
Yeah, they're backed by Google also.
Right, exactly. Yeah, that's one of the reasons I feel like there's probably going to be a merger of these projects at some point in time. But moving on, the other announcement was with Android. They're just calling it Android L right now. Really the key features that I saw were they're calling it a dramatic UI overhaul, again going back to this material design concept. My term, not theirs, is universal syncing, where you're going to see a lot more cross-device interactivity. So like from your phone to your watch to your TV, even to your car, things sync up a lot. So they're really kind of focusing on a simpler user experience across devices. It's actually available today. It should be available like right now, actually. And the other interesting thing is they've taken little bit more focus on the enterprise as opposed to just general development with data separation. So the idea is you have your work phone, you have your home phone, right? And those two things, you really don't need two devices. You should be able to bring those together in one. So now there's some physical separation, I guess, on the device. I'm not 100% clear on it. Just caught it quickly this morning, but again, something kind of interesting. See where that goes.
What do you have on their Samsung Knox?
Yeah, that's who they're working with Samsung, and yeah, that's where the security layer comes in.
I just learned about Knox the other day. So.
Gotcha. I just learned about it this morning. So, so then the other thing was Android Wear, which this is actually a Samsung device, but they have their own device coming out. I think 2 of them are coming out today, and then there's another one coming out later in the summer. So again, kind of focusing on the wearable devices there. This particular one, they were syncing with the phone, TV, car, that kind of good stuff. So again, just something to check out. It's interesting, and there's a lot of possibilities for app developers utilizing all the free SDKs. And then the final thing is if you guys are familiar with Bootstrap or Zerb's Foundation or Semantic UI or some of these other basically Kickstarter templates for developing HTML pages, Google released in beta this web starter kit. I haven't played with it a lot, but my interpretation of it is it's kind of a more scaled down version of these things, lets you do a little bit more. One of the key things that drew my attention is it's delete friendly. Like when you're using Bootstrap or Foundation, there's a lot of stuff in there that you don't always need, and you want to be able to strip that out when you deploy your application. This is supposed to offer a little bit more friendly way of doing that. And it really focuses on kind of the responsive design aspect of things. Again, just worth checking out. So that's kind of the overview of things that I've seen. Anybody else have anything cool? Feel free to pitch in. But that's kind of what I'd come up with quickly. So customizing your workflow.js. What the hell is that? I mean, what is Workflow.js, right? To really understand that, you kind of have to have a good understanding of workflow, or at least we all have to be on the same page. So workflow consists of an orchestrated and repeatable pattern of business activity enabled by the systematic organization of resources and the processes that transform materials, provide services, or process information. Oops. I like to think of it more like this. It's how we get things done, right? Workflow.js is really just an idea around using JavaScript and the tools available in the market today to get things done better. You may say better, well, how's JavaScript going to make things better? Especially with my workflow, it's already awesome. It runs smoothly, stays on track, best thing ever. It runs like a champ all the time. And I can say it right, How many times have you been working on an application or developing, or frankly, any other part of your life, and you just come up against hurdle after hurdle that you don't expect? Well, that's kind of what, like these guys here, I really feel a lot like them sometimes when I'm developing. I mean, you just look at the guy, especially on the left here, the face there. That really says a lot, especially when I come across something that, I've dealt with in the past, but haven't dealt with it in a long time. I'm just frustrated, and there's another hurdle to jump over all the time. So the reality of things is that our workflows usually consist of a lot of hurdles, a lot of different processes, a lot of different pieces. A lot of these things tend to go overlooked. You may say, so what? I still get stuff done, right? I'm sure everybody in here that's developing is productive in some way. You're getting something pushed out, you're getting something shipped. But at the end of the day, you're doing a lot of the same stuff over and over, causing yourself more stress, taking more time. And sometime that's going to come out. You're going to feel it at some point. And so my thought is the smallest changes in your workflow can generate really big results. Now this goes both ways. They can be positive or they can be negative. Just like the picture here, the domino effect of your time will be shown through your workflow. So if you establish a bad practice or something that takes a long amount of time, and then you just keep repeating that over and over, it's going to catch up with you. especially if you go to transition a project. That's one of the clear cases that I see all the time. You get in, you do a project, you hand it off to somebody, you don't touch it for months, you come back and they don't know what you did. You know, you have to transition it back and forth, and it just ends up being a mess. So it can be a real problem if you don't have a streamlined workflow and things that work for you. But at the same time, if you make a little change now, sometimes that can save you a lot of time in the long run. So that said, a lot of people don't really think about their workflow all that often. It's like, well, what do I do? Where do I go? You know, how can I make my workflow more effective? Because I'm already feeling pretty good. That's kind of how I feel. You know, looking for areas where you can make your workflow more efficient is kind of like a Where's Waldo puzzle. Really though, if you look for communication, this is the #1 area where I have seen things fall down all the time. Projects get delayed, run over, and usually it's just because of communication. So that said, my background is I do a lot of consulting. I work with a lot of clients, and so my environment changes all the time. I never really know what I'm going to end up with. And so a common use case is if I'm creating a prototype for someone, I'm going to start off with a mock-up. And I've got balsamic mock-ups here. You do a little bit of work, come up with a design, and then you request feedback from the client. Then you go into the prototyping phase. Again, you request feedback. Then the client comes back to you with something that you just really don't want to do. You know, make the logo bigger. So you begrudgingly make the logo bigger. And this cycle keeps going. After you've done that, you request feedback again. And then they say, you know what, scratch it. We want something completely new. So you redesign something completely new. You request more feedback. That's inefficient. I have wasted so many days just going back and forth with clients about, well, this little thing needs to change. My drop down needs to have this item in it, or you know, this color needs to be changed. Little changes that if you're working, especially think like a remote team. If you're working with a remote team and you say, hey, you know, I need this change done, and they're not on the same clock as you, sometimes that can be a day before you're going to see that little change. And if you're looking for an approval or a sign off or something, you know, that can add up really, really quickly. And it's ultimately a time suck. So that on its own, you know, just the general flow of communication kind of sucks. But in this specific scenario, make that a little bit bigger here, things get worse with the technology. You know, if you're prototyping an app, a lot of people will end up needing to set up some sort of live environment, and this was really the case for me. You know, you'll see needing to set up Apache or IIS or Nginx or some other web server just so that you can show your application to a client. Especially think about like a single page application. If you have a single page app and you want to have some real data populating, say, a drop-down box, you're going to need to have some sort of AJAX control in there. So you're going to have data. If you've ever tried doing that without a web server, you'll see that it doesn't work because there are security restrictions. So you're kind of forced into using a web server. So getting all that set up adds a lot of additional overhead. Then there's the deployment to the test server, and that's assuming you even have a test server. A lot of people put stuff right on their local, you know, laptop, and they'll work from there. And then redeploying on every iteration. Every time there's feedback requested, you go back and forth. And it's frankly just a pain in the ass. And you know, you end up feeling like you're dealing more with red tape than you are in actually developing anything. So that kind of gets, you know, sets the table here. This tool is one that I created. It's called Phoenix, and it's a static desktop web server. So it's being able to launch a website quickly on your desktop and kill it quickly as well. And it really addresses a lot of these pains that I've been going through, both with the communication as well as the technology. And so I'm going to dive into a demo here. So this presentation that you're watching right now, the slides anyway, is actually being hosted by Phoenix right now. It's just a simple desktop server. with a list of all the servers that I have running. These are all the different projects that I'm just playing with. Some of them are, important. Some of them are just for fun. But the bottom line is I'm able to run these and get data back and forth, sending JSON back and forth. And just to demo that, I'm going to pop this open in another window here. So here we've got some JSON coming back, and you'll notice that it's running over HTTP. So this could be fed directly into my single page app, and it'll just work. Now that's great. So there's a technical thing accomplished. I no longer need Apache. I no longer need IIS or Nginx running on my desktop. I can just fire up a server and go. Firing up a server is pretty easy. Hit new, give it a name, tell it the directory, tell it the port, and it'll fire up. More importantly though, this stuff can be shared. And this is where the communication breakdown starts to diminish. I work with a designer in Los Angeles, and I've got a developer in Nashville that I work with. So we're in different time zones, and we've got a lot of different things going on. Now, when I need to work with them, I'll share my server, or they'll share theirs, running Phoenix on their desktop, and you'll be able to see what's happening on their desktop right now. Now, it's not like screen sharing or anything like that. It's just being able to see their web server. So it's kind of taking your laptop, your desktop, and converting it into a public web server temporarily. All this stuff gets funneled out over a secure protocol, so you're not actually exposing your local desktop to the internet, but you are able to share the contents of your web page. And let's just take a look here. I know we've got last month, or earlier this year, another server going. But what I'd like to point out here is, and if you can see this, I'll make it a little bigger here. All right, it's going to cut it off, but up here in the URL, you can see that there's actually a publicly accessible URL. So if you were to look at your laptop right now and type in that address, you would get this page on your screen, and you'd be able to navigate through it. So the value of this is that I'm working locally. Maybe you guys are reviewing my work, and you say, hey, I want something done. I don't like this, this picture here. Please change it. I can do that very quickly, and you just refresh your page, and you see it. So you see it live. It's something that you can touch and you can feel. Instead of having to send a screenshot back and forth to people, or getting on the phone. Usually what I do is I just have like HipChat or something open, and I'm sending over a link, say, hey, check out what I've been doing. Let me know if you like it. I get my feedback just like that. And I can also iterate very quickly that way. And then when I'm done, I just turn it off. And that's it. It's no longer accessible online. So it's kind of a quick way to fire things up, throw them away. And I guess since most of you are new, you probably weren't here for last month's presentation, but there was kind of a concept of thinking about your infrastructure as more disposable resources. Like fire up a server, use it, and discard it when you're done. This takes that same concept and brings it to the desktop. The final thing is, I'm actually not so much of a UI guy. I'm more of a back-end guy. I like to develop web services. I've been using webhooks a lot lately. And that's where this other feature kind of comes in. And this isn't something that I mentioned during the initial part of the workflow problems, but for me, a challenge that I face all the time when I'm working with a third-party provider is, they've got this webhook, it'll come out, data's there, but it doesn't match up with the documentation that's on their website. So I'm constantly wondering, why is my app not quite working? I'm getting partially what I expect, but not everything. So this tool, which comes here in Phoenix, will allow you to actually inspect a webhook. So I'm going to come in here. I'm actually going to unshare this. I just hit my own local web server with some JSON data, kind of mimicking what I would do with a webhook. There's actually a video online about, I've done this with GitHub, where every time I push a commit, it'll send the hook back to this screen. So I can actually see and inspect the JSON here and say, okay, well, what's the name of that attribute? Is it FN for first name, or is it first name spelled out? Did the documentation get it right or not? So I can actually see what's actually happening. And this particular version with the yellow toolbar on the top, this is a local thing, so you wouldn't be able to do this from the internet. But if I share this, you would be able to. So the value in that for me was, hey, now I can start working locally on my laptop, no matter where I am, whether there's an internet connection or not, be able to develop my back-end tool and my front-end tool at the same time. So as a result, my prototyping productivity, really skyrocketed. So those are kind of the features of this tool, and it's really pretty simple, right? A lot of you are probably looking at this saying, well, it's a web server, big deal, right? But the amount of hours that I've saved in the communication alone has more than warranted the amount of time that I put into building this tool. Okay, this is kind of lost the punchline, but I think it was a weekend or two ago, I had a client from Brazil contacted me and said, we're really low on resources. Everybody's more interested in the World Cup right now. I need some help. So we took something that probably would have taken about 12 days normally, was able to condense it down to about 12 hours. Now, that's a completely number just for me. That's not what you would necessarily see. But the point in all of this is that this tool that I developed primarily for myself was something that made me a lot more efficient. And it's just because I put that upfront effort in and said, all right, I'm going to do this. It's a process that I have to go through all the time. And now I'm saving myself days at a time. So your mileage will vary. Would definitely be different for you, but maybe it would be maybe it'd be great.
So is this tool freely available?
Yeah, it's free. Yeah, I should have mentioned that. Free, open source. Download it. We'll cover a little bit more of that in a second. I'm going to dive into how that tool was made in just a little bit, so we'll be covering that in a second. The last point that I wanted to make, though, on this around taking just your workflow as a concept and taking the tooling around it is when you're thinking about your own workflow and how you might be more productive or more efficient, anytime you say, I wish this happened or that happened, or why can't it be simple like this? If you start saying that more than once, you really need to start thinking about, hey, maybe this is something that I'm actually doing more often than I think. And what I had to do was, with these web servers, I've installed so many of them so many times that I didn't even really realize how often I was really doing it. So I just started writing a check mark every time I did it, just a tally. And it ended up happening so often that I thought, I can't ignore this anymore. I can't believe how much time I've been wasting just on basic infrastructure here. And that's really what it came around to. So if you do struggle to think about your own workflow, just start thinking about what you wish you had. And that's a great place to kind of get going. Now, with this particular tool, I could have just kept it on my own, just used it for myself, and I did actually for a while, for several months. But I'm not alone. I'm not the only person that has had this kind of workflow issue. And it's pretty apparent in the last 6 to 7 weeks, basically not a whole lot of effort, 400 tweets, 500 GitHub stars, and there were 4,700 downloads as of yesterday. That's in 6 to 7 weeks. It's growing at about 100 to 200 every single day. So clearly people are using it. It's all over the world. Companies, I'm really kind of surprised. I didn't anticipate that. But the point is, if you think something may be too simple to automate in your workflow, it might not be. There are probably a lot of people out there that are just saying, oh, setting up a web server, well, that's pretty easy to do that in my sleep. But there are a lot of people that don't want to do it or do see the value in having these workflow tools around. So that said, it's kind of a high-level pitch on the tool itself. I'd like to dive into it a little bit. How could you make your own workflow tools? How can you do this stuff for yourself and make yourself more productive? I do know that there are some people online, so for those of you that are less technical, this is going to get kind of geeky here. We're going to dive into some of the components that make up Phoenix. So first, there are 4 main components to this tool. There's desktop shell, and that's the piece that actually allows you to run it. You see the icon on the screen, you see it pop up on the screen as well. There's a server infrastructure. That's what's actually providing the web server or the API or the webhook handler. And then, of course, there's the graphical user interface, which I've kept really simple. And there are some installers, which I haven't demoed here, but you can online if you want. And again, getting back to the Workflow.js thing, we're going to pour some JavaScript awesome sauce all over this and just see how can you do this today with the tools that are out there. So first off, this is built on node-webkit. How many people here know about node-webkit? Okay. Are there any people just like, how many people know about Node.js in general? Okay, all right. So node-webkit is very much like PhoneGap or Cordova in the sense that with PhoneGap, you take your HTML5, JavaScript, CSS, all of that, and you wrap it up, and that can be deployed on a phone as a so-called native app. Node-webkit essentially does the same thing except for the desktop. So there's a couple of good points about it. So if you're thinking about building your own tools, node-webkit will run on Windows, OS X, and Linux. So that's kind of cool. You can reuse everything. You can use the standard web tools or the standard things that you're already used to, like HTML and JavaScript. And for this slide, I'm going to say it's like Chrome. So one of the advantages there is that you don't have to worry about cross-browser compatibility. And it also means that you can take advantage of some of the newer features that Chrome has that maybe aren't in every other browser. You can even get into some of the experimental stuff if you really want to. You can set some flags and everything. I haven't done that personally, but I do know that it's possible. And then Node-webkit, of course, yeah.
Well, it's called WebKit and it's related to the WebKit libraries.
Yes, yeah, it's related. It's not, I say Chrome because I'm going to cover this in a second, but there's some separation between Chrome the browser, Chromium the engine, and then the WebKit engine. So I will get into that in just a second. But the other good point about this is that it supports a lot of the native stuff that you would expect in the desktop application, like icons and system tray stuff, native menus. So Node-webkit in general has a lot of things that can make desktop development with JavaScript fairly simple. And going back to the Node.js thing, you can implement any NPM module. So for those of you that aren't familiar with Node or NPM, NPM is the package manager, how you install modules, and there are a ridiculous number of modules out there. I lost track. I lost track around 35,000. So if anybody knows, let me know. But there's a lot of code out there that you can use that you don't have to write on your own. Now the bad, and I know this is a longer list, so don't be turned off from Node-webkit immediately, but there's a lot of, if you do your research on Node-webkit, you'll see things like, oh, it starts up slowly. And that is true, and it's not. Node-webkit will take all of your files, it'll bundle them up, basically like a zip file, and that's how you deploy it. When you launch it, so when you go to your desktop and you double click on the icon, you want the application to load, in the background what's happening is it extracts everything, and then it runs the application. So if you have a large application, it's going to load slowly. And that's just something you need to be able to work around because you don't have to do that. You don't have to follow that approach. So I've seen some presentations that are just like, oh, Node-webkit's too slow on startup and it degrades the user experience. I disagree with that. You can get things loaded. You just have to know that there's a compression issue there. And that's all documented in the issues. So the point is, be thorough in your research. And with Phoenix, the way that I got around this was I used an installer. All the code comes uncompressed, it's loaded onto the desktop just like it would be anywhere, and then there's an icon that you click on. That's really all there is. That's what the installer does. It sets it up, makes it easy so that the user doesn't have to go through that process of configuring this application on the desktop. One of the other bad things about Node-webkit is that there's no notifications API. And you couldn't see it on here, but Phoenix has little notifications. Every time you launch a server, it'll pop up a little toast window in the corner, letting you know what's going on. There's some audible stuff in there, so you can kind of keep an eye in and ear on what's going on. And the reason why this stuff doesn't work natively is because it's not really Chrome. So to get back to your question, it's running on the Chromium embedded framework, and Chromium and WebKit have a tie, but Chrome itself is separate. It's kind of layered on top of that. So that's where the notifications API sits. So when you think about developing with node-webkit, a lot of people think, hey, it's just like developing in Chrome. I can create everything in my Chrome browser, and then I'll port it over to node-webkit later. And that's not really true. There are some APIs that are not available in node-webkit, but it really boils down to what has Google done and knowing that. So that's a challenge you're going to come across with a lot of different libraries, but that is something that I came across. And just my resolution for that, I ended up using Growl. So if you're a Mac person, you probably know about Growl. If you're not, Growl is, again, just a little notification system that's easily installed on basically every operating system. The other bad thing about node-webkit is that there is some version lag in Node.js. So if you're really bleeding edge and using the latest Node.js, like 0.11.23, I think, or 26, or something along those lines, it's not going to be available to you. And there are features in those versions of Node that you're not going to be able to use in Node-webkit just because it's utilizing a stable version. It's got to be tested, and it doesn't even come out. Like, you're not going to see the latest stable version either. And that's just simply a development iteration thing. Some people have security concerns with Node-webkit, and it's viable, I think, but at the same time, it's a question of how concerned are you? The real concern comes around your code is all accessible. It's just an open file. So if you really want to, you could dive into Phoenix and you could open up the JavaScript file and you could see it there. So if you're developing a proprietary application, that could be a problem. But for a workflow tool or something that you're sharing with your team, and the likelihood of that being a real issue is a lot less than if you're distributing this application for profit. That said, there are some ways to kind of get around that, but this is not unique to Node-webkit. I'm going to cover a couple of other tools here in a second, and it's the same across the board. The other two big ones, these were ones that did affect me more, were permissions and App Store issues. Again, when you're developing a tool that works on multiple operating systems, you might be able to use HTML across all these operating systems, but you're still restricted by the OS permissions. So, simple example, try to put something in the program files directory on Windows, and you need to have administrative permissions to do that. Try to launch a service, you gotta have the same thing. On Mac, you're gonna have similar kinds of issues, and on Linux, you can have permission issues as well. So bottom line is, it comes down to, what are the user permissions here? What is my user going to be doing? Are they going to be administrators, or are they going to be regular users without elevated permissions? So that was something that when I first launched Phoenix, I had a lot of people get back to me like, I can't write to the file system. And that's because I was trying, the servers that you see on the list are all stored in a JSON file, and I was storing that in the directory where Phoenix was installed, which was program files. So a lot of these Windows users were coming back to me saying, hey, I was able to install things, and I thought, okay, great, when they're installing it, you're going to install with elevated privileges, but when you're running it, you're not running with elevated privileges. So there were some issues there, and if you're going to create an app for yourself and distribute it, that is something to think about. And again, that's also not specific to Node-webkit. There are, all the other tools are that way as well. But something that is specific to Node-webkit are App Store issues. These tools can be delivered through the App Store. With Node-webkit, there are some things baked right into the core application that Apple simply will not approve. So they've been working on that. There's a lot of active development with Node-webkit, but that is something that can be a problem if you need to distribute your app that way. And again, this all goes back to the workflow idea of, hey, how easy is it for someone to install my application? If it's in the App Store, it's pretty easy to go and click install, right? As opposed to having to download something. So, it might not be a major issue, but it is still a potential issue if you're really trying to streamline your workflow and make things simple.
Supported on Google Play.
I think so. I haven't tried that yet.
I thought this was for desktops, though. And you're talking, it's just cross for phones too.
Well, yeah, I think so. That's why I'm not sure. To answer his question, I'm not sure about Play, but
Well, Play can run on Chromebooks and stuff too.
yeah, that's why I think that you can do it, but I haven't tested that, so I don't actually know. So I'll get that a little larger here. So there are alternatives to node-webkit. The first one here is called MapGap. And that one I find kind of interesting because it's very much like node-webkit, but they've gone in and stripped out all the things that make it so that a node-webkit app can't be deployed on the App Store. So a lot of people have been using this as an alternative, and it doesn't, there are some differences there, but it kind of falls in the same vein as node-webkit. But hopefully, you can get your app out through the store if that's important to you. It also strips out a lot of code out of Node that kind of bloats everything, so you will see a little bit smaller file sizes. There are some other tools. Does anybody use Brackets in here as their IDE from Adobe? Yeah, I'm the only one. Brackets is, it's a product in development. It's open source from Adobe. It's an IDE, so just a code editor. But it's all based on JavaScript. It is based on Node.js, and they wrote their own shell for the desktop. It is out there. You can use it. You could technically use it to create your own apps. That has been promoted. You'll see it in blogs. I contacted the Adobe team directly, and they said, "No, we're not supporting this." So it's kind of a use at your own risk kind of thing. And the same goes with the new Atom shell. Has anybody worked with Atom yet?
I tried it out.
Tried it out? Okay, cool. So for those that aren't familiar with it, Atom is kind of the same thing as Brackets almost. It's an IDE developed by GitHub. And it was recently open sourced. They were going to make it I think it was going to be partially open source, partially commercial. But now the whole thing is open source, and the shell, like Brackets shell, is another node-based thing that you can use to run an application on the desktop. And if you haven't seen these, they're kind of pretty editors. The Atom shell reminds me a little bit of Sublime. Brackets is kind of on its own. There's a lot of different themes. But these are options out there. So if you are working on a workflow tool, say you want your own editor and something that isn't available, you can go and contribute to Brackets, or you can develop something on your own here with a lot of the initial work done for you. Some of the others, Desk Shell is another one. That was originally called Ext JS, which was similar to node-webkit, where you can run node scripts as a GUI window on your desktop. It hasn't had as much traction as node-webkit has. Then there's Win.js from Microsoft, which is obviously a Microsoft-centric solution. And really it focuses more on kind of the Metro feel. So if you're, like I've got Windows 8 on here, see a lot of the slidey stuff, a lot of flat design. That's the kind of stuff that you can do with Win.js. Another one is Qt from Nokia, which is a little bit less JavaScript focused, but they have a language called QML. It's a little bit more involved. There is a higher learning curve, but you can also do more advanced stuff with it, and you can use JavaScript at the end of the day. So it's just something to check out if this is something of interest to you. And then the last two on here are Chrome extensions and Chrome apps. Everybody's seen these. Chrome extensions are a great way to get started with JavaScript for your own workflow tool. It's something you can distribute easily. Apps, same kind of thing. And then there's the Chromium embedded framework, which I don't actually recommend using because that's what most of these other things are based on. You're not really going to be diving into JavaScript. You're not going to be using common web languages. Instead, you can be diving into things like C++. So if that scares you should probably stay away from that. And really, the reason I wanted to give you all this information here is because these are important decisions when you're thinking about what do I use to help my workflow go better. And so, in my opinion, for for Phoenix, node-kit or node-webkit won out primarily because of the community support and the velocity that it has. There are a ton of people using this right now. It's backed by Intel, and there's new development all the time. I'd say every couple of weeks I see new stuff that gets committed into the master branch, and then you see releases on a pretty regular basis, and for the most part it's been really stable. So that's something I've been really happy with. The project is pretty mature at this point. There are more professional features that some of the other desktop shells don't have, like icons is a simple one, desktop icon. Atom shell doesn't have that, brackets doesn't have that. I find that node-webkit's easier to distribute with installers, so I will cover the installers in a second here. And I had prior experience with node-webkit, so kind of go with what you know, right? And I also didn't know about some of the alternatives. Like if I were to go back and do this again, I might consider MacGap for the Mac version of this, simply because of the distribution factor. It's going to be easier to distribute it through the App Store, and it has basically all the same stuff that I would need from a functional level, without some of the bloat. So that's what I would do if I did it again. Linux is something that I chose not to support. So if you are doing node-webkit, what you really need to think about is, do I want to support all of these operating systems? Because even though it can, you don't necessarily want to. In my case, I felt like it would be hard to maintain this simple tool by spreading it out onto Linux, mostly because there's so many flavors of Linux. There's not a lot of people that are using Linux as their desktop, so just a smaller community. And it's not something I use on a day-to-day basis. So I thought, well, I can't really get into this. I don't want to set up a development environment to support this for people. So I just said, I'm not going to do it. I'm about saving time, not about creating more work for myself. That said, Phoenix does run on Linux, and a lot of node-webkit apps will run just fine. I just chose not to support it, for the reasons that I just went through. So now we get into the server infrastructure, which is a little bit more node-based. So we've covered the shell. That's how you would get your app onto the desktop. Node is what I'm using for the servers. I'm going to cover just a couple of modules. I can fly through this a little bit if it's not of interest to everybody. But for the web servers, the stuff that you see, the core component, I'm using the send module, which if anybody is using, how many people do use Node in here? Is anybody, okay. All right, so you're probably familiar with Express. The send module is the static component of Express. So I chose that one because it's simple, reliable, and easy to configure. For SSH tunneling, that's the sharing mechanism of the tool that allows you to share this with a remote worker. That's using a module called Local Tunnel. There are some other tools out there, but really there's only two that I came across that are viable. One was Local Tunnel, which is Node-based, and the other is called ngrok, which is Ruby-based. The request browser and the API are both Express-based. I chose that primarily because if I ever decided to do anything more comprehensive than just static web servers, Express would be a good fit for that. And I wouldn't have to get into anything like Restify or having additional modules there. Just keep it as simple and clean as possible. Try to keep the code consistent across the whole base. There's port detection. That's a port scanner thing, and there's markdown support, which I used Marked. That's Marked is a library. It handles GitHub flavored markdown, so you can render code on the screen, code examples, along with any other markdown that you may be using in your project. And I'm going to skip over this last one here. I'm not using Node Windows or Node Mac. That's projects that, if you know me, those are some of my own projects that help run scripts as services on any operating system. Like you can run a native Windows script or a native Windows service with Node script, or same thing on Mac or Linux. But since we don't have a lot of people in there, I'm going to skip over that. There is a command line feature that I wanted to have, and this was, again, going back to the workflow. As more of a back-end guy, I spend more of my time on the console. So I created a really simple console tool here, and I wrote it in Node because I was comfortable with that. And I wrote an API into Phoenix. So what this does is you can install this, this Phoenix CLI here, and you can list your servers, you can start new servers. I can CD into a directory and just say Phoenix start. It's going to launch up my server, right from whatever directory I happen to be in. I could say Phoenix browse, and it'll pop it up in Chrome for me, or whatever your default browser is. So it was just another tool that I used to make my workflow a little bit simpler, kind of adding on. And I think that's really the important point, is once you have a couple of these tools out there, you can see how your workflow can get better and better by adding on, complementing that as you go and as your workflow changes. So this tool also had an API. It's not a REST API, it's just straight up data and events, kind of an AJAX thing. It's out there, it's documented, so if anybody is interested in this, wanting to play around, but in language of your choice, whether that be Python, Ruby, or something else, there is an API. You can create your own command line tools. So if you're not a Node person, that's something that you could do if you don't want to start from scratch on your own. So the third component of the tool is the graphical user interface. And this is just standard HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. And I've had a lot of questions recently about whether or not I used any frameworks or anything like that to create the front end, because there are, let's face it, a lot of them available. But I didn't. This is primarily just my own code, but I was able to use a couple of things that you can't necessarily use if you're constructing a web page for large audience. Things like Flexbox. Flexbox is a CSS thing that just makes positioning a little bit easier. And it's not supported in every browser yet, but it is supported in Chrome and WebKit, so I was able to leverage that. So when you're creating these tools, it's not necessarily as complex as it might be if you're developing a web page. So you kind of have to shed some of those preconceptions about making things work on every browser and just think what works for me. It's almost like dirty development in a way, where you can just kind of get down to doing what you need to do and you don't worry too much as long as it works. So that's what I did for the UI here. I did use a couple of libraries, anime.css and hover.css, and I used jQuery to simplify things. I did use some of the more, or some of the ES5 constructs, just to make sure that I don't go over anything here. Ecmascript 5 JavaScript, right? That's basically what it means. There are several things like object.define property. That's something that's an ES5 and also an ES6 construct that you can't necessarily use in every browser, but it makes a lot of sense in your own workflow tools if you like to follow, say, an object-oriented approach. I use that to kind of construct little JavaScript classes and just extend them. So I follow this principle of I'm going to build small little pieces that work, and then I'm going to build on top of them. And I like to do that with my JavaScript just as much as I do with infrastructure. So I kind of took that into account. And then the final thing that I think is important is that I use my own mini MVC / event bus kind of approach to this. Does that sound foreign to anyone? Or do you know what I mean when I'm saying MVC or event bus? No? Okay. All right, so MVC is model view controller pattern, where you have your data models, you have your views, that's what you're seeing on the screen, and then you have your controllers, which are basically binding those things together. An event bus is essentially a system that will handle events. So when your system fires an event, it could be a click, it could be a swipe. Any kind of event, it's going to listen to that and respond any way that you want. Or at least that's how I designed this particular one. I'm really greatly simplifying those concepts, but it was important in this particular application because it wasn't like developing straight up desktop software or straight up web software. You're bridging, you're taking one environment with node-webkit, you're saying I'm going to do both my UI and my backend stuff all in the same environment. So what I ended up having is these node classes that I had created for the web server, and it could fire an event saying, hey, the web server's up now. Great, well, how does that affect my UI? And in a lot of new apps, you might use something like WebSockets to send that event over the wire, or maybe you're doing something with an AJAX feed or REST API to communicate that. But in this kind of application, everything is all in one environment. So I kind of hacked my way through this is really what I'm getting at. I tried to use some MVC just to get some structure there so that if somebody else were to sit down and look at it, it wouldn't be completely out of their element. And the event bus side of things, similar concept there, just something to give some structure to this code. But at the end of the day, I didn't use a framework because there isn't really anything available for this kind of environment, not across all the landscapes. I mean, Win.js is probably the closest one because that's really targeting the Microsoft environment. But there aren't you're not going to go out and find a node-webkit framework right now. So it's something that you're kind of on your own to do, but just use what you're comfortable with, and you can get these things done. So the final piece of this were the installers. 2 installers, Windows, Mac. Mac is super easy. You create a DMG file with .app, and you're good to go. It's basically just a folder, you stick your app in there, and have an icon, and that's really the extent of it. Windows is not quite as simple. Now, with Windows, there's a trade-off, though. With the Mac, Phoenix is shipped, and it's a much larger file because it's shipped with node-webkit, it's shipped with Node.js, it's shipped with all the files, and then you just drag and drop. So great, you have an app that you can run, but it's big for download. The Windows installer is substantially smaller. I think the Mac one is around 40 megs, and the Windows one is just under 4 megs. So it's a tenfold difference there, and the reason for that is these installers can do a lot for you. You can simplify the application on the desktop. So I used Setup for the Windows installation. And what I'm able to do is say, hey, I want to install this in this directory, just like you would expect. But it'll download node-webkit, and it'll download some of the other extras only if you want to use them. Now, if you go out and use this today, you'll see that it's just kind of one straightforward installation process. But in a prior version of this, I had a couple of different downloads that went along with Phoenix and node-webkit. In particular, Phantom.js was used to generate screenshots. That is now native in node-webkit, so I was able to cam that. But at the end of the day, there were several different components that I needed to have available, but not everybody would want those. I've actually had some complaints saying, hey, we really don't want this. It's just floating up our PC. So Setup was a nice way of giving people what they want and only what they want. That said, it's not entirely trivial. It's not hard to set up an Setup file, and that's really all it is. It's kind of very Pascal-like, so it's slightly foreign if you haven't dealt with Pascal, but it's really not that hard. There's a lot of examples out there. It's fairly easy to get going. And if you're not a Windows person, I realize that a lot of people in this meetup are Mac people. In fact, I think, other than maybe one Windows desktop. But for those that are on Mac, you really if you get rid of your whole Windows audience, you're getting rid of a lot of people. And for me, the statistics on this, I have more Windows downloads than I do Mac downloads. And now maybe that's just because there is a built-in web server on Mac. But still, the numbers aren't lying to me. It's pretty equal market, slightly higher with Windows than for Mac. So if you just say, hey, I'm going to develop a tool, and maybe you're distributing it through your company, and maybe your company is a mix of things, you really don't want to, especially if you're a Mac person that's not real familiar with Windows, getting back to this stuff can be a real pain. Troubleshooting can take you a really long time, especially because things change from version to version of Windows. So it's just kind of a mess sometimes. So I would suggest that if you create a workflow tool out of one of these libraries and you want to distribute it to other people, take the time to make sure that it gets distributed properly. Make sure that you're not going to have a lot of people hammering on your door saying, hey, this doesn't work, or I can't access this or that. It's not a fun experience, and it kind of goes against the principles of saving time. So that's really what I wanted to cover with the installers.
Have you looked at making it available on Homebrew, or I think there's a Windows one called Chocolatey. Everyone's playing with this, pretty cool.
Yeah, I've seen that. I haven't tried that one yet.
Pretty slick.
Yeah, I know that they're pretty similar, Brew and or Homebrew and Chocolatey, but I have started looking into distributing it via Homebrew. Haven't had much time to do that, but I've had a couple of requests, so I'd love to be able to do that. The more channels I can get it out to, the better, and I think that's kind of a great point to bring up.
Right.
App stores or what?
Yeah, Homebrew is kind of like a package manager for Mac, or Chocolatey is a package manager for Windows. And package manager in the sense of like the Linux package manager. Like if you're on a Linux machine, you can say apt-get install some package. And it figures out, okay, you need this package, and this, and it installs it all and just does it all, automatically in the background. And it interacts with it all to get it to happen.
Yeah, it's pretty nice. It's definitely smooth, and any packages that they support. Yeah, it's very rare that you're ever going to come across an issue. So it's smooth workflow there with that. So that was kind of Phoenix in a nutshell here. If any of this is of interest to you, some tips for starting out is really first, just get inspired. Some of the things that I talked about earlier, thinking about your workflow, whether that be something that's nagging you that you don't want to deal with anymore, or some way of saying, hey, my productivity can increase if only I could do this. And it's okay to think small in these situations. You don't always have to think big. This application here is one that I'm working on. It's a Chrome extension. And when I first started thinking about this, I thought this is the stupidest idea I think I've ever had. It's a JSON documentation tool. So I paste my JSON into the left and I start commenting each line. The whole point of all of this was I was working with JSON that had some kind of funky attribute names. And it didn't really make sense. So I wanted to have documentation so that when I transferred this project over to the developer that was going to maintain it, they'd know what they were talking about. So for me, simple workflow tool, even though this is just, this is literally what I've been working on the last couple of days, but even in this state, it's been saving me time. Some other apps that are out there, the Koala is it's a SAS tool. So is anybody familiar, or are you guys familiar with SAS, S-A-S-S? Okay. So if you're not familiar with it, SAS is a pre-processing language for CSS. So basically you can shrink your code, you can kind of programmatically change things, like changing colors. You can, instead of actually typing in a color value for your font color, you can say lighten some variable name by 50%. And it will automatically do that. So you can then go back and change your variables and change your entire style just by changing a couple of variables. This tool takes a lot of that out of the command line for you and just watches your system. It's kind of a way to set things up because SAS is not exactly the easiest thing to get set up. So this was just a simple tool that made an impact for a lot of people. Here's a personal Kanban board, just something that makes sense to people to have in-house. If you need something private, you don't want to use Trello or one of those tools, you can do this, or it's just a feature that's missing. You can add it in yourself. This one is called Squiggle, and I think this is actually a commercial product now, but it's also based on node-webkit. It's a collaboration tool, just video and IM here, which you can see on the right. But the thing that I'd like to point out is it's kind of blurry, but this box is code. So if you've used HipChat or any kind of instant messenger, well, I guess HipChat now has this, but a lot of them, they don't have code formatting. So if you're sending code back and forth with people, or if you're not doing screen sharing or something, you're pasting your code in, it's ugly when it comes out. This tool is a way of making it prettier, a little bit easier to see. So again, small improvements in workflow. I can't tell you what the results were for this one, but I do know this company has landed some funding and are doing fairly well for where they currently are. Simple time tracking. There are other tools out there to do this kind of stuff, but again, if it doesn't fit your workflow, these are not that complicated to build. And so that's really about it. So in a nutshell, it's really just, I I encourage you to think about workflow. The stuff, even if some of it sounded complicated, it's not really that hard when you get into it. Phoenix is an open source project. You can go and check it out. You can download the source code. You can run it directly. You can use that as a starting point. And that's kind of about it. If anybody has any questions, happy to answer them. Trying to wrap up. I know a little bit early here. Don't need to take this whole time. So, but that's really what I wanted to cover with you. So hopefully you learned something. Hopefully you got something to take away from it.
And we normally at the end of the meetup also kind of go around and see if anyone has any announcements or anything like that. Like earlier we heard that he's looking for a job, if anyone's looking for like an entry level .NET type. My company is actually looking for kind of a senior JavaScript Node.js guy. I don't know if anyone in here is like that. If you know someone like that who might be interested in kind of a startup environment, let me know. Does anyone else have any announcements like that?
I was kidding earlier when I said I was a lazy bum. I actually am looking for a job, but I've been kind of taking it easy the last few weeks and enjoying my time off. So, but I'm looking for intermediate JavaScript and also back-end Java position where I can
All right.
do cool stuff.
Intermediate JavaScript, Java. Anyone else? Anyone who has a company who's hiring or works for someone who's hiring? Cool. Well, like Corey mentioned on the slide there, we normally head a block over to Buffalo Billiards if anyone's interested in just grabbing a beer, maybe chatting a little bit more about this stuff or about anything else. If not, certainly we won't be offended, but I think at least Corey and I are going if no one else is going.
Where is that?
It's just literally a block over on 6th Street, on 6th and
It's on Sixth
Brazos.
Street.
Yeah, 6th and Brazos.
Yeah.
Whichever. I think it's that way.
Yeah, that way.
But other than that, if there's no more questions or anything like that, thanks for coming out, and hopefully we'll see you guys at a future meetup. Probably not you, but everyone else. But anyway, thanks for coming out. Appreciate it.
Thanks.